afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here as I present A+ Motivation, the Role of Grades in Education. Like Dr. Wolf said, my name is Halle. Okay, so first today I will be summarizing my literature review, which detailed both human motivation and grades as motivators within the classroom. And then I will be summarizing the case study I conducted where I aim to answer the following questions. Are grades used as motivation in classrooms, and how do teachers view grades? So when I first began this project back in the fall, I found myself asking, why am I completing this? Am I going to benefit from it, or am I just doing it to get a grade and to fulfill my scholarship requirements? This idea of why led me to the topic of human motivation. This was a topic that we had discussed in EDA 250 with Dr. Walsh, my advisor. In this class, we read part of a book, Drive by Daniel Pink, which detailed human motivation, and this led me to further research on the topic. Through my research, I found that humans are motivated in two main ways, either extrinsically or intrinsically. So first, looking at extrinsic motivation is when an external stimulus is needed to complete a given task. Intrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is when someone enjoys what they're doing just for the sake of doing the task. Some examples of common extrinsic motivators within the world include money, praise, competition, rewards, punishments, and as we'll see, grades. Some common intrinsic motivators, on the other hand, include curiosity, critical thinking, and creativity. As I continued my research in extrinsic motivation, I looked at a theory by B.F. Skinner called behaviorism, and that detailed classical conditioning versus operant conditioning. And so classical conditioning is when there are natural responses that occur due to stimuluses being introduced before the action. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, is when behavior is shaped by consequences that follow an action. And so both are examples of extrinsic motivation because they rely on external stimuli in order to create behavioral change. On the flip side, when looking at intrinsic motivation, Daniel Pink detailed three things that help build the motivational framework for intrinsic motivation: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So autonomy is the desire to have choice, mastery, the desire to get better at something, and purpose, the desire to contribute to something larger than oneself. So as I continued to do my research, I also read a book called Punished by Rewards by Alfie Kohn, an educational researcher and author, and he argues that humans do not always require these external or extrinsic motivators in order to function, and that we can rely instead on intrinsic motivators. And so that led me to ask the question, if humans can function without rewards, why does society remain so dependent on them? So extrinsic motivators such as money, praise, and grades are everywhere in society and are heavily relied on. And research suggests that they continue to be used because A, they are produce immediate behavioral change, and B, they are easy to apply. For example, if a child is told that they must eat broccoli before eating their pizza, the pizza now becomes a reward. The child complies, usually quickly, without argument, but this does not teach the child the intrinsic value for the healthy food. I continued to research the use of extrinsic motivators, and I wanted to focus on their effectiveness, and through this I found that they have four main limitations. They can act as punishments, they can negatively impact relationships, and they can disregard rationality, and they can prevent risk-taking. So first, extrinsic motivators can actually act as punishments. A study detailed in Pink's book, Drive, shows the effects of rewards on participants interested in completing a puzzle. This table will detail the interest. So on day one, they were given the task of completing the puzzle, and no reward was introduced. However, the people were still interested and wanted to complete the puzzle. On day two, when they were asked to complete the puzzle, they were given a monetary incentive. And the interest, not surprisingly, increased. They were more motivated when money was applied. Day three, however, the reward was removed, and the group of people actually became less interested than even day one, their initial interest in completing the puzzle. And so this experiment shows that interest initially increases, but drops significantly once the reward is removed. The same can be seen in a classroom setting as students receive a sticker atop their spelling test during week one. Much like day two, a reward is being applied. However, if they don't receive one on the following test, like day three, the interest will decrease and they will have less motivation to study for the next spelling test. The second limitation of extrinsic motivators is that they can negatively impact relationships. So the first relationship at risk is between the rewarder and the recipient, as it can create a power imbalance. Praise, or money, or grades can be used as a control mechanism, and the recipient will then become dependent on the rewarder, causing tension within the relationship. The second relationship at risk, when extrinsic motivators are applied, is between peers, as it can create competition. This can lead to cheating and shortcuts. Instead of peers viewing each other as collaborators, they now view each other as barriers, and this will lead to a lower quality of work and, again, tension within the relationship. The third limitation of extrinsic motivators is that they may disregard rationality. They ignore the original reason for the behavior, which will prevent meaningful long-term change. The introduction of extrinsic motivators within the system actually will go against the intrinsic motivation, or the reason that the child was acting a certain way in the first place. The fourth limitation of extrinsic motivators is that it can prevent risk-taking. People tend to do only what is required in order to receive the reward that's being applied. This can lead to reduced creativity and effort. For example, if a student is asked to write 3 sentences for the assignment, the student may only write 3, even if the assignment could be more complete with 6. This is not always the case, but can occur when extrinsic motivators are introduced. So now turning our attention to the role of grades within the classroom and how they can act as extrinsic motivation. Dr. Heather Leslie at the University of San Diego says that grades teach students that the point of school is to get points. Additionally, Lori Huff at Harvard Graduate School says that at most schools, there is no consistency about what's included in the grade or what's left out, even among teachers teaching the same subject in the same school to students in the same grade at the same level. And so this led me to ask, so what role are grades really playing within the classroom? I found through my research that there are 4 main purposes grades can serve. They can serve to motivate, to reflect, to categorize, and to provide feedback. So first, looking at motivation. It was found through research that grades do motivate students. However, just like any of the other extrinsic motivators, it can lead to reduced interest, creativity, and risk-taking. The second purpose grades can serve is to reflect student knowledge. Once again, it was found that this purpose can be seen as grades reflect understanding of the content. However, because there are often non-academic factors being included into grades, such as behavior, effort, or organization, they are sometimes inaccurate representations of only student knowledge. Huff argues that a C+ a student receives could tell you that the student is semi-proficient in their knowledge of science. Or it could tell you that they're very proficient in their knowledge of science, but had a disorganized binder. The third purpose that I found grades can serve within the classroom is to categorize students. This is seen as grades are used for GPAs, scholarships, and college admissions. However, as seen previously, grades are not an even representation of students' academic abilities, therefore altering the effectiveness of the categorization. Additionally, the role of teachers, when grades are applied in this way, shifts from a supporter of learning to a gatekeeper for the student's future successes. The grade gets between the people, causing the relationship to crumble once again. The third purpose that grades can serve is the final purpose that grades can serve is to provide feedback. It was found that once again, grades do provide feedback. However, research indicates that it's not effective. A letter grade does not explain strengths or weaknesses within the child. Instead, it tells you what the letter they received was. So how can we shift the purpose of school away from grades and to the learning? Instead of asking your child, how did you do on the test, or your student, you could say, what are you learning in class? Emphasizing the importance of the learning taking place and not the grade being received. To shift our focus from the grades to the learning, researcher Pink suggests to emphasize intrinsic motivation through autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So autonomy, once again, the desire to have control over one's actions. We can alter our grading systems to allow student autonomy by giving students choice, such as self-assessment, flexible assignment options, or even helping a student-built rubric. We can also help increase intrinsic motivation with their students by encouraging mastery, or the desire to get better at something. One way we can do this is by focusing our grades on learning at the end of the unit rather than in the middle. Only grade when the student has had has enough time to master the content. The second way that we can encourage mastery within our students is to avoid grading effort and focus on purely content. Research suggests that to get the focus off of grades, they should be purely a reflection of knowledge with behavioral influences absent. The third way we can increase intrinsic motivation within our students is to give them a sense of purpose or desire to contribute to something larger than oneself. We can do this by limiting unnecessary grading and emphasize meaningful assignments that support long-term learning. Meaningful assignments don't work only to support learning, but cause a desire within students to apply the content they are learning outside the classroom walls. Researcher Cohn says that to gauge student interest, we should see if they talk about school at the dinner table. After my literature review, I still had the following questions. Do teachers really think the purpose of grades is to motivate their students? And how much do teachers think about the impact their grading practices have on their students? So to do this case study, I conducted an IRB-approved interviews with 3 high school science teachers and used Zoom interviews and analyzed their responses using deductive and inductive coding. So here is a table just highlighting the participants that I interviewed. Once again, 3 high school science teachers, because that's this field that I'll be going into, and just limited confounding variables. And I didn't mention this on here, but they're all from Northwest rural communities, or Northwest Iowa rural communities as well. And then here are some of the research questions that I chose to focus on, emphasizing mostly on when the teacher, I'm so sorry. Okay, focusing on when the teacher assigns a grade, what do they hope it communicates to their students, and then what do the students receive as the meaning of the grade. So, like I said, I did a deductive and inductive coding. So deductive coding, I looked for pre-identified themes within the participant responses, and then for the inductive coding, I looked for emerging themes that came out from the participants' responses. So the 3 themes that I chose to look for in the transcriptions included grades being used as motivators, a gap between student and teacher perception of grades, and then implementation of mastery-based versus behavior-based grading practices. So first, looking at grades as motivators, all 3 teachers, while it was not explicitly said, did see that their students were being motivated by the grades they were given. For example, participant 1 says she uses a 10% focus on professionalism as part of the grade, and she emphasizes that at the beginning of the year, she tells the students that this 10% contribution can help swing the student's final grade. So right away, she's putting the focus on the grade and how the student can work to change it. Participant 2 also noted that students are motivated by parental expectations. She commented that the students think, if I get a C+, my parent will be happy. Once again, the grades are being used as motivation to meet an expectation of a parent, a school, or others. Participant 3 also observed changes in effort based on grades throughout the semester. He saw that if the student wasn't happy with their grade initially or at midterm, that they would increase their effort in order to get it higher. So through all 3 of the participants, it was found that grades are serving this purpose of motivation within the classroom. The second theme that I looked for in my deductive coding was a gap between student and teacher perception of grades. So here's a table just highlighting what their responses kind of look like. And so it was found that all 3 teachers had similar perspectives on what they thought the purpose of grades should be. They all reflected that they believe grades should reflect understanding. However, the students replies very drastically. So some of the teachers thought their students viewed it as a possibility for higher education, some viewed grades as expectations of the school, and some viewed grades as mastery of the content. And so, as you can see, there is that gap between student and teacher perception of grades. The third theme that I looked for through my deductive coding was implementation of mastery-based versus behavior-based grading practices. And so I looked at participant 1, and she broke her grades into 3 categories: professionalism, formative assessments, and summative assessments. And so in her professionalism section, she graded things like punctuality and turning in assignments and having neat papers, things like that, that would reflect professionalism. And so that would be more of the behavior-based grading practices. On the other hand, the formative and summative assessments would be more mastery-based, looking at how well the student actually knew the content. Participant 2 included both behavior-based and mastery-based grading practices, as she included bell ringers that were once again reflections of punctuality and effort, and formative assessments that reflected student mastery. Participant 3 said he focuses purely on content mastery and strongly opposed behavior-based grading. He emphasized that through his teaching years, he has reevaluated his assignments to ensure they contribute to the student learning and mastery of the content. Okay, and so moving to my inductive coding, these were the two main themes that I found emerging from amongst the participants' responses. So the first being tension between teachers on their view of mastery-based grading practices, and then the second theme I found were differences in teacher grading practices despite a common belief of grades' purposes. So the first theme, all the teachers disagreed on whether behavior and effort should be included within their grades. Participants 1 and 2 wished to include behavior and effort reflections, while participant 3 was strongly against it. The second theme that I found, differences in teacher grading practices despite a common belief of grades' purposes, was even with shared beliefs that grades should reflect knowledge, the implementation varied significantly. Not all the teachers were grading only mastery of the content, even though that's what they desired it to reflect. And so to conclude my case study, again, I wanted to answer those initial questions. How do grades serve as motivators within the classroom, and do teachers think about the impact their grading practices have on their students? So it was found that teachers' main goal in grading is not to motivate their students, even though it is still serving that purpose. The second, teachers' overall hope is to convey learning as the goal, with grades being a measurable reflection of progress. And assumed student perception of grades revealed that traditional letter grades do not lead the student to see a reflection of learning, but a reflection of status. So considering all this research, it is found that extrinsic motivators, such as grades, often fail to create change. And instead, we need to help students become intrinsically motivated by promoting autonomy, mastery, and purpose within our classrooms. This can be done by increasing student choice and allowing student-built rubrics, encouraging mastery by focusing on learning rather than effort and grading only when learning is complete, and giving students a sense of purpose by grading only when necessary. So I just want to thank you all once again for coming to my presentation, and I will now open the floor up for questions.